Hello and welcome once again to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And just a quick reminder, as always, that Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts you give to us are tax deductible. We do need your support to continue to do all of the things that we do, including our publications that we release, the videos, the podcasts, the online seminars and courses that we offer, the articles that we have on our website. All of that does take a lot of work, and we are looking for support. We also would be happy to get your support in other ways. So you can give information about who we are and what we do to those who you think might be interested in supporting us and our mission. So you can go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page, and you can get some resources there as well to share with others. All right, so with all of that, we are going to be jumping into the topic of the program today. And what I'm talking about today this is part of our Makers of the Modern World series. This is now becoming a book. I have written the entire book, and now I'm just kind of going through and doing some edits to finalize some things here. But some of the figures that I have written about in the book, I haven't actually given a talk on. And so one of those that is left at this point is David Hume. David Hume is a very significant figure in the history of philosophy, in the history of just ideas in general, whether it's theology and questions of apologetics, which, David Hume kind of sets the stage for what a lot of those questions that apologists are going to have to kind of address for the following century or even until today. He has an influence in politics. He had a friendship with Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, which is why I'm wearing my Adam Smith tie. There was a book probably about 5-ish years ago, released on the friendship between David Hume and Adam Smith. A bit of an interesting story there, as both figures are essential to the shaping of especially the Anglo-American world, but also beyond that. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the ideas of David Hume and then British empiricism in general. So we'll talk a little about this kind of distinction between rationalism and empiricism, which is central to understanding what's going on intellectually in the 18th century in Europe at this time. This talk follows on the earlier talk I did on René Descartes. If you're watching these in the playlist, you very well may have watched that one already, but this is being recorded later. So if you want to get chronologically where we are here in the history of modern philosophy, you want to start with René Descartes. I did 2 videos there. Even if not, you should be able to follow along okay. And I have just a brief overview of Descartes in here for the context of understanding Hume's philosophy as well. Okay, so if we're jumping into the philosophy of David Hume, we have to understand this divide that is occurring right now between these two kind of philosophical schools. Now, when we use a distinction like this, okay, so we're talking about empiricism and rationalism. When we use a distinction like empiricism versus rationalism, or other distinctions within various ideologies, whether it's in philosophy or theology, we're often using those terms as kind of broad characterizations that are not exact. Like recently, I had somebody asking about my my talks on Christology, dealing with the different schools of Christological thought, the Antiochenes and the Alexandrians. That is one of these distinctions that is really more so about general tendencies than it is something that can be, every figure can kind of be grabbed onto and squeezed into one of those two categories exclusively. And so with a lot of the thinkers that we generally think of as empiricists or rationalists, there's a bit of mix of things here. So that's just an important qualification as we jump into understanding what this distinction is. If there's anyone that's just like completely anti-rationalism in the fullest sense, it would be David Hume. So he's kind of the most extreme among the rationalists here. So essentially this division between empiricism and rationalism is a way to understand the ways in which knowledge is gained by an individual. And so the empiricist focuses on experience. So the empiricist is one who's going to focus on knowledge as that which is gained or derived through one's experiences in the world. So there is a focus on sense experience, what somebody learns through the senses, through what they hear and what they see, and the various events that occur within their lives. The rationalists, instead, in contrast, are going to focus on knowledge as it arises from innate ideas. So when I say innate ideas, we're talking about ideas that are essential to us, that are present within us, that we didn't learn from anywhere, right? So this is the notion that there are certain concepts that just exist within the mind that we didn't have to, learn from a teacher or learn from parents or learn from just experiencing the world. They're things that are kind of inherent to the structures of our minds or the structures of our thought. And we'll talk a little bit more about ways that is teased out here. Okay, so knowledge arises from innate ideas as part of rationalism, and the other is that there is this focus on knowledge that is rationally deduced through logical reasoning. So there is an optimism about what the human intellect is actually capable of, what it is that we are capable of knowing. The empiricists tend to be a lot more skeptical about what reason or what the human mind is really capable of understanding in its own powers. And so the rationalists believe that we can rationally deduce all sorts of truths about the world, about the universe, about us, about God, depending on who the rationalist is, that we can discover all of these truths by means of reason alone. And here in this image on the slide, I know some of you are just listening to the podcast, but on the slide, there's an image of John Locke and René Descartes. And these are kind of two great representatives of both of these schools of thought. And so John Locke is a empiricist. John Locke is famous for his political philosophy, but also his work on human knowledge. John Locke is the one who speaks about the human mind as a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. This idea that the human mind basically has nothing kind of imprinted on it at the moment of birth, and so that all of our knowledge is this imprinting of these various experiences and sensations throughout life, which accounts for knowledge. I do have a talk on Locke that's going to be in this as well, but that's not, at least the time of recording this, that is not currently available. Okay, so there's John Locke, and then René Descartes. We've talked about in the previous talk in this series. René Descartes is one who begins his philosophical system trying to find an indisputable ground of knowledge and then reasoning out from there. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a minute. Empiricism is generally the go-to methodology in Britain. And so sometimes this will be called British empiricism. You'll hear that phrase used a lot. So major figures that are associated with empiricism are Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. We are talking about Hume today. I'll be talking about Locke later, though focusing more on his political thought. And Berkeley, I don't have any plans to do that, but perhaps I will. Rationalism was instead prominent on the continent of Europe. So generally, they are not going to be from the UK. So we've got René Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. Interesting figures there as well. I don't have plans to do programs on Leibniz and Spinoza, but let me know if you want me to do any of these figures, because I'm open to doing those. They're just not in my initial kind of set of figures that I wanted to discuss here. Okay, so then let's talk about rationalism in a little more detail. That's your very basic, broad distinction between rationalism and empiricism. This is all important to know when we're looking at the work of David Hume, because David Hume's work really is built in response to a lot of the approaches to philosophy that are predominant at this time, particularly the Cartesian rationalist school. And he does respond directly to Descartes, but he's responding to all sorts of other figures as well. It's not just Descartes. He's living significantly past the time period of Descartes, though Descartes' influence is certainly felt at his time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what are the basic ideas of Descartes that form his rationalism that David Hume is responding to. Now, the first kind of maybe most essential element of this is what I already alluded to just a minute ago here, and that is that knowledge, real knowledge, true knowledge, derives from an indisputable ground of fact. And this attempt to do this begins prior to Descartes. Pierre Chiron is doing this popularly in France just prior to Descartes. And Sharon essentially tries to find some kind of a place where there is something that is basically indisputed, right? And he says that, we need to find, if we want to have real knowledge, like committed, actual, complete certainty. I'm talking about certitude, really. Certitude necessitates some kind of indisputable, definitive place upon which knowledge can rest. And Sharon comes to the conclusion that we just can't find that. and so Sharon is a skeptic in a lot of ways. And he has this kind of thoroughgoing skepticism, and Sharon's very much okay with that. Descartes is not okay with that skepticism. So what Descartes wants to do is prove that there is such a definitive ground of knowledge that we can indeed build on and have certitude about what is real, and have certitude about what reality is, how we can know who we are as human beings, whether God exists, those kinds of major questions. So Descartes believes that he has found this indisputable ground of knowledge within self-knowledge. And so Descartes has the very famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum." And so that particular phrase defines René Descartes, the beginning of René Descartes' philosophies. This is in his book Meditations on First Philosophy. And so he begins with this kind of doubt, skepticism, and asks all these skeptical questions. And then he comes to this conclusion, well, if I can doubt all sorts of things, one thing I can't doubt is that doubting is happening. And if doubting is happening, you've got to have somebody that's actually doing the doubting. So the doubter exists. And that's where he comes up with this phrase, "I think, therefore I am." So he's saying that, well, if I'm thinking, I at least know that I exist. And then Descartes provides a couple arguments from there for the existence of God. And so his arguments for the existence of God then prove to him, okay, I exist. And from there, I can argue that God exists. And from God's existence, now I can reason to the trustworthiness of the kind of senses that God has given me, because if God exists and God is good, he would not simply deceive me throughout my life and make me think that all sorts of things are real that are not. So we have this kind of general reliability on the senses. So Descartes really begins with skepticism, but ends without skepticism. And that's the goal of his project, is to say that there are indisputable rational reasons to not be an absolute skeptic about everything. We're going to see that Hume kind of grabs onto that and says, actually, Descartes, that's not indisputable at all, and moves the kind of needle back toward this skepticism. And then Immanuel Kant kind of comes along and tries to deal with the skepticism of David Hume. So along with this, there's the basis in Descartes there. But along with understanding Descartes, it's important to understand a little bit of what are just some of those ideas that are essential to rationalism, besides just that indisputable ground of knowledge. And one of those is innate ideas, which I had just mentioned. Now, the idea of innate ideas, this notion that there are things that we know to be true, that we believe to be true, that are just part of our human nature, that are not derived from anything. This idea is not something that's new with the rationalists within modernity. This really goes back to Plato. In Plato's dialogue, the Meno, there is this discussion between Socrates and this slave boy who doesn't have an education. And through a series of questions, Socrates kind of discovers that this boy knows truths about mathematics that he had never learned from anywhere. And so out of this comes this idea that knowledge is really recollection. That when we are learning things, we are in some sense drawing upon something innate that is already within us. And for Plato, this derives from his idea of the preexistence of the soul. And so this is going to take different forms in various different figures, not usually identified with the preexistence of the soul, though, Origen of Alexandria maybe is an exception to that rule. But for the most part, that's not going to be adopted. Okay. But nonetheless, there's still plenty of validity to what Plato is getting at here in this dialogue. Now, Descartes, when he speaks about innate ideas, sometimes there's a bit of a misunderstanding, I think, of what innate ideas are. Descartes is not saying, like Plato seems to be, that there are these just fully formed concepts that everyone just has. For Descartes, it's more that these ideas are like a potential that exists in the mind, right? There is a kind of tendency toward believing or adopting certain truths. So it may not be these kind of fully formed, clear, doctrines that exist within the mind from, conception or whatever. Instead, this is just that human beings have these potentialities that exist within nature that are then kind of actualized, though he's not really going to use those Aristotelian categories too much, but actualized through our experiences and the way that we reason throughout life. Leibniz has a distinction here that's used a bit, talking about innate ideas, and this distinction is between necessary ideas and then those ideas which are not necessary. They're generally like more contingent ideas. And so when we're talking about innate ideas, we're talking really about those things which are universal truths, those things which are necessary truths. We have this distinction that Immanuel Kant later is going to make between a priori and a posteriori truths. A priori truths are those truths which are not derived from experience. And a posteriori truths are those things which are derived from experience. The a priori truths are those which are universal. They are not contingent. They are necessary realities. And so the rationalists are generally going to talk a bit about these kind of necessary ideas or universal ideas, rather than just looking at particular experience. And Leibniz discusses this with this categorization of possible worlds. This becomes really essential to 20th century analytic philosophy, but it derives from Leibniz. And essentially what Leibniz is saying is, there are certain things that could be different in a theoretical possible world, but there are certain things that could not be different because they're just contradictory in another possible world. So, for example, you could conceive that there would be a possible world in which World War I did not happen. Right, there are a number of historical circumstances that had to line up in exactly the right way for that war to break out, and so there is, theoretically, you can just say if X, Y, and Z went differently, then that historical event did not happen. However, there is no possible world in which a bachelor would be a married man. And you could say, well, there's a possible world in which that word identifies something else, but the concept of a bachelor cannot mean that, because the concept of a bachelor is the opposite of that, just necessarily, okay? So it's not a contingent truth. It's not contingent on history or experience. It's a universal reality that such is the case. And arguments for the existence of God today often grab onto that some of those distinctions between possible worlds to say that God is not God is a necessary truth rather than a contingent one. Okay, then we have the question that arises here with innate knowledge. And this is a really essential question for understanding a lot of modern philosophy. And that is, how do our sensory perceptions translate to abstract ideas about things? And so throughout our lives, as we are going about our lives, we perceive all sorts of things in all sorts of ways. These are our sense perceptions. And so we think of as the five senses. But the question is, how does my sense experience, which is really this series of kind of totally divided random encounters, how does that translate to an idea in my mind? Because those two things are very different. If I walk up to a dog, right, and I pet that dog, I have an experience of feeling the dog's fur. I see the dog, and I have the experience of the image of that dog coming into my vision. I hear that dog, right? I hear its barking, which is an experience of something happening within my ears. Or sometimes dogs smell pretty bad, so you got the smell of the dog. Hopefully not tasting the dogs here. So we have all of those elements of our experience that are really totally separate things. So the question is, how do those separate sense experiences, how do I take all of those things and then translate what is a physical experience and then translate that into an idea And not just an idea of the smell, and not just an idea of the feel, but a universal idea that encapsulates all of those elements. They're two very different kinds of things. Like the mental conception is a very different thing from the physical interaction that I may have with a particular object. And so this innate idea, this notion of innate ideas, tries to respond to that, to say that because there is this kind of maybe potential for ideas about the world around us that exist within the structures of the mind, that means that when I have these sense experiences, they connect to those innate ideas. The classical way of dealing with this within classical philosophy is, the notion of the forms. That Plato has this idea that there are these immaterial forms or ideas that exist within the mind. They're mental things, but they also exist in some way in reality within the physical things in the world. And so if there is this immateriality, this universal idea that is mental, but also the immaterial is reflected in the material, that means that there is this necessary connection between those things. And we'll see Hume is going to answer that essentially by saying there are no universal things at all, right? There is no real reason to assume that there is such a thing as this unified dog. We assume that that's the case. We operate as if it's the case, but there is no necessary connection between those things per se. Though he is going to have a kind of connection with his notion of impressions and this complex ideas that arise out of impressions that we'll talk about. Okay, so then we have this relationship between intuition and deduction that is essential to the rationalist. That's Leibniz in that image there. Some realities can be intuited by direct experience. That's the a posteriori knowledge I mentioned. That's Kant's distinction. And then other things are known through rational deduction, and that's those a priori truths. So the rationalists have a superiority of reason over experience. That one's kind of obvious just by the name itself, because reason provides universal and indisputable knowledge. And so if reason provides this kind of universal knowledge or knowledge that's not so easily mistaken, it necessarily is superior. Think about, and this is a discussion that occurs with relation to a lot of kind of skepticism of like historic Christian truth claims in terms of historical veracity of the New Testament. There is an argument that says, well, look at history, like just the nature of history as a discipline. So as a discipline, historical history is dealing with probabilities. And what are you doing? You're looking at not even your direct experience, you're looking at someone else's experience and how those other people wrote down their experiences and how that experience was interpreted or passed down. Well, there is a lot of room to doubt. However, when we're dealing with, say, more universal principles or laws, something like, say, the scientific laws that govern the universe, those kinds of things, well, those are pretty universal. We're not dependent upon the experience of somebody else. We're not dealing with probabilities in the same way. We're dealing with universal reality. Mathematics would be an example of this. And so this plays into a lot of Immanuel Kant's ideas. And so the rationalists are very much on the side of trying to say, well, we have to have this kind of superiority of reason over experience. So something like the discipline of history, and I'm not saying the rationalists don't believe in the discipline of history, but that's always going to be kind of secondary because that's never going to get at these universal truths that they believe are greater than that which is contingent within history. Another reason for this is just experience is more likely to be mistaken. And that's what Descartes says, and that's how he operates within his arguments in his Meditations on First Philosophy, in that he speaks about this experience of the experiences he has of the world, and he says, well, I could be deceived, right? People can be crazy. You could be in a dream and have experiences, and those don't correspond to reality. Or so it could be some evil being manipulating my head, so I think things are real that aren't. But the universal truths of reason are more reliable than that. And then we have this distinction between necessary and contingent truths that I had mentioned with Leibniz here. Okay, and that history is like contingent and reason by itself is a necessary truth. or provides necessary truths. Not that reason itself is a truth. Okay, then we'll jump from there into David Hume. So what did David Hume do or believe or teach in light of all the stuff that we just outlined here? Well, very brief look at David Hume's life. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. In terms of his family life, he's born in Edinburgh, Scotland on April 26th of 1771. And his parents were relatively well off. His father was a lawyer. David's father died when he was only 2 years old. That's when David Hume was 2 years old, not his father. That would be weird. And his mother never remarried. So he didn't have a father figure in his life. People have kind of taken that a bit and run with it in terms of his skepticism of religion and relating that to daddy issues, but I'm not going to get into any of that. Okay, then he studied at Edinburgh, the university there. He was 12 years old when he started his studies. After finishing, he had this seemingly like totally nervous breakdown and kind of became a recluse for a brief period of time. After he recovered from this breakdown that he had, he moved to France. When he was there, he began writing his treatise on human nature, which really is probably his most significant work, though he has a lot of significant writings. He then eventually comes back to Scotland, and he hopes to get a professorship while he's there. He wants to teach, and he is a candidate for the chair of moral philosophy at Edinburgh. And there is a lot of pushback against David Hume because of this, because of his views related to religion specifically, right? So this is a pretty important academic position, and he's working within the field of moral philosophy, and so you can kind of understand why those who were, who believed in the truths of the Christian religion, the Christian faith, that they wouldn't particularly want a one who was accused of being an atheist, at least, to have a position teaching morality there in their city. And Hume kind of denies his atheism at this point, but his later posthumous publications reveal that he, well, maybe not a committed atheist. There's some debate about what his view exactly was, but he was probably pretty close to that position. So then he leaves again for France, and France is becoming increasingly secular. You got the French Revolution, and you've got France moving away from its Christian past, and because of that, he's kind of safer there than he was in Scotland. Though, interestingly, Hume is really not a proponent of revolution at all, just a safer place for him to be at that time. And then his work on natural religion is published posthumously. So after he dies, that work is published, which is a major critique of religion, but it's actually, it's in a dialogic form, so it's a dialogue, and you've got these three different characters, and nobody's really sure which character David Hume is, or if he is any of those characters. So it's hard to actually pin his own views down, but his skepticism is pretty obvious. The skepticism is clear in other texts as well. Some of his major works, this is in all of his important books, but just some of the ones to highlight here. Treatise on Human Nature is 1739, and this is in three books. This is the first David Hume work that I read. I read this back in college, and I actually found it surprisingly easy to read, and I think, not that it actually is easy to read, I think it's just because I read Hume after Kant. But then you've got his Essays, Moral and Political in 1742. He has another volume of that's released not long after that with some more essays. Philosophical Essays Concerning Human Understanding, 1748. And then The History of England, which is a major historical text from 1754 to 1761. That's a really influential text, and it's gone through a number of editions throughout the year. It's been very consistently printed and read since. All right, so let's talk a bit about Hume's anti-rationalism. And we've been talking all about rationalism because a lot of Hume's thought is created really to critique rationalism. And Hume's reputation is debated quite a bit. Or his motives are debated quite a bit, and his general kind of orientation toward the world is debated quite a bit. So you've got essentially two kind of broad interpretations of David Hume. The one is that Hume was basically just a skeptic. That Hume's, driving motivation was really far more to tear down than actually have much of a constructive philosophy at all. And this tended to be the case for a number of years, that was the predominant view. Now it does tend to be the case that scholars, especially those who specialize in Hume, and if you specialize in Hume, you probably admire him to some extent, so you don't want him to look like just a skeptic, right? So Humean scholars tend to try to argue that really underneath all of that is a positive project, and that it was really Hume's positive project that drove his writing much more than this constant skepticism, and that constant skepticism was just kind of incidentally there as a necessity in order to build up a more positive system. And, well, to give my kind of personal interpretation, I'm not a scholar of David Hume by any means, but I've done quite a bit of reading of Hume. I do still tend to fall on the skeptic side. I do. I think when I read Hume, I think that there's something of I won't say there's no positive project whatsoever underneath what he's doing, but my reading of Hume tends to be that he is far more interested in tearing down than building up. I'll just put it that way. But it's important to acknowledge that there are different interpretations of him and his project there. And of course, as a Christian theologian myself, this is going to I'm not going to be very sympathetic to a lot of Hume's arguments either. So that's an element of it, of course. All right. So Hume's anti-rationalism is found first in that he denies that reason is as central to the human experience as is often assumed. So the rationalists tend to have this view of human nature that we really are capable of this kind of pure objective reasoning, setting aside of biases, finding these indisputable grounds of knowledge. There is this optimism about what human beings are capable of mentally that just isn't there in David Hume. And so, and in most modern philosophers, by the way, the kind of optimism about human rationality that you see in some of the rationalists isn't really held to even by those who are more in the rationalist kind of mode of doing philosophy. Well, at times, and this is where Hume seems to go a little bit beyond where some of the other empiricists go, and this is part of the reason why I feel like Hume's skepticism really is driving his project in many ways, is that he makes these very bold statements at times that he seems to denigrate reason or the usefulness of reason in pretty bold ways. So here's just one example of this, and that is that he says reason is a handmaiden to the passions. And so the passions this is a category that's used by classical philosophy, talking about this kind of inner, most basic kind of desires that we have. So the passions could be, a desire for like food, for example. I feel like that's the most common, obvious one, though there are a lot more than just that, than just the bodily desires. But we'll just take that as your example, right? So you have a desire for food, and for the classical philosophers, the desire that you have to eat it's a good thing, right? Passions are not always bad. It's a good thing to have a desire for food. If you don't eat, you're going to die, right? So, but it can also become bad if it's not governed by reason. And so the hunger that somebody has internally can become a negative thing if someone decides that they are just going to give into that desire for food excessively without any regard to what it is they're eating or how much they're eating, right? Then you become a glutton, you become very sick, and you could harm yourself in significant ways. So that would be a kind of giving into the passion. So the role of reason then would be for the classical philosophers, and we're talking like a Plato and Aristotle here, to govern that. So that reason has this role of saying, okay, wait, I may have a desire to eat, but then you stop and think, but is it a good idea to, eat 3 large pizzas tonight? And then your reason says, no, you're going to feel really terrible and you're going to spend the entire night in the bathroom. So maybe that's not a great idea. And then you say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to, eat a little less than that. Hopefully significantly less than that. Unless you have an insane metabolism, I guess. Yeah. Okay. I say this because as a teenager, I remember back when Domino's did this 5-5-5 deal, they would do 3 medium pizzas for $5 each. I remember ordering 3 pizzas and eating all of them, which is just not a good idea. Don't recommend it. Wasn't functioning based on reason there. So Hume reverses that, right? So he's like, well, reason is really a handmaiden to the passions. It's the other way around. And he's very purposefully trying to be provocative with those kinds of statements. But it just gives you an idea of one of the ways that he kind of really moves hard against the possibilities of reason, not only toward the rationalists, but also toward the classical philosophers also. Okay. Hume rejects these universal innate ideas within the mind. So he doesn't think that those things exist. So we're not functioning based on these necessary universal ideas that all human beings have. He rejects really all forms of metaphysical realism. So he rejects the notion that we as human beings are really capable at all of understanding what nature is, what reality is, what exists, who exists, what existence is, what reality is. So he would deny what Kant refers to as the thing in itself. He would deny that we have any knowledge of what things or objects or ideas really are. All we know is our experiences of those things, and that's it. So Hume responds to Descartes' cogito, which is his cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. And Descartes believed that this particular statement was one that was definitively true, right? It was provably true. And in that statement, Descartes believed that he had found this indisputable ground of knowledge. And so he thought that if I can recognize that I'm thinking, which is obvious, this is kind of he's having this immediate experience of thinking. And so Descartes really talking about the immediate experience of thinking, not the logical process by which we figure things out in thinking. But we have this immediate experience of thinking, and if that's the case, then Descartes says there has to be one having the experience, and that's who I am. So I'm the one that's having the experience of thinking. I am a thinking thing, is Descartes' perspective. And Hume questions this, though. And he just asks the simple question, but by what principle are you saying that thinking means that there is a thinking thing? Isn't that just an assumption? Isn't Descartes just making the assumption that to have a thought is to have a thinker? And he says essentially that all you get to there with Descartes' argument is that as you're having the experience of the thought of doubting, all that you can say is that there is a thought of doubting. Really. There is no definitive logical grounds by which you move from the thought of doubting to an actual doubter. And we'll explain that a little more in a minute. Hume denies the whole project, right? Hume denies the whole project that Descartes is starting from, that the rationalists in general are starting from, which is this search for this indisputable starting point of knowledge. So Hume basically says there isn't one. There is no indisputable truth by which all of our reasoning somehow derives. And so it's in this discussion of and critique of David Hume of Descartes, that David Hume then uses some of the vocabulary that's going to be essential for his whole system here and develops this. So the first of these that you need to know is this word impression. And so when he's talking about this Cartesian doubt, this experience of doubting in thinking that's found in Descartes, he refers to this experience or what's going on there as an impression. And so Descartes has this impression of that he is thinking. And so what are impressions exactly? Impressions for David Hume are these immediate, direct sensations of things. So they're immediate experiences. And these impressions they're not thoughts that are a reflection on experience, right? We may have experiences that are having like a logical thought process that arrives after some kind of experience, or it doesn't even have to be logical, but just any thoughts about our experience in one way or another. But these are the direct experiences themselves that are generally those of the senses. Now, the Cartesian doubt isn't really something of the senses. It's something that's just going on in the mind. But generally we're talking about those things which are experiences through the senses, but not exclusively. So tasting an apple, Not the thinking about the tasting of an apple or thinking about what it tastes like or, thinking through the process of like, well, what kind of apple is this? Or how does this differ from this other apple? No, just the experience directly in itself. Seeing a mountain, not the reflection on, oh, that's a pretty mountain, but just the experience of seeing it. Feeling the ground with your feet, right? So these are just the kind of immediate sensations that you have that are these impressions. Now, we do have, we have simple impressions and then we have complex impressions. So a simple impression would be if you are having an experience that includes all sorts of different senses. Now, I mentioned before the experience of seeing a dog, right? So say I'm up close to the dog and I pet the dog, my eyes are on the dog, and I smell the dog all at the same time, right? And it's one event. So it's not like I'm doing one thing after the other. They're all happening at the same time. Well, for David Hume, there's a simple impression that is threefold, right? I have one impression of the smell, one impression of the touch, and then one impression of the sight, what I'm seeing with my eyes. And then there is the complex impression, which is the experience as it comes together. So all of those elements coming together is the complex impression. But still, all of those things that form one experience are just an immediate experience that happens to work itself through all the senses. Then we have what he calls secondary impressions. The secondary impressions are the feeling that results from these primary impressions. So we have all sorts of feelings, and he's not talking about just the feeling that you get of like reflecting deeply on something, but that kind of immediate feeling of that arises within the self when you experience something. So we've got the impression that is the sense impression itself, and the experience of the impression, the secondary impression that arises within the realm of personal feeling or sentiment, as we'll talk about. Then we have ideas. Impressions are not ideas. Ideas are distinct from these impressions, and ideas are later reflections upon these impressions. And so this is the thoughts that you have after an experience. And so I may, pet the dog, and then I may walk inside and start thinking about the dog. Maybe I think like, oh, I'd like to get a dog, maybe I want to get a dog like that one, or would I want to get a dog like that one? Or, boy, that dog was kind of nasty because he tried to bite me in the face, or whatever, These are just the thinking processes that occur when you're reflecting on the experience that you had. And these ideas that you see here can be either simple or complex in the same way. And the simple ideas are really exact copies of impressions. And so my idea is really just the impression itself kind of embedded in my mind. Then we have complex ideas, and this is what we use in our rational capacity. These are our reasoning processes. And this then is, for Hume, what explains the way in which we think about things. So for David Hume, thinking is not this rational process that is dependent upon any kind of innate idea within us at all, but thinking is simply just putting impressions together in your head. All thinking is really just a combination of your sense experience or of impressions. So if that's the case, you can't really, intellectually, you are not able to arrive at truths outside of those impressions. You're not able to use your impressions and reason towards something that exists outside of those impressions. And so you can't, for example, for David Hume, and we'll talk a little bit about his religious thought here, but for David Hume, you can't reason from your experiences of the world to the existence of God. Whereas a lot of the classical arguments for God's existence necessitate that there is this human capacity, this intellectual capacity to have experiences, think about what happens in those experiences, and then think about the logical kind of conclusions about those experiences and say, well, if this is true, then this is true. And if this is true, then this must also be true. And now you arrive at something that is not just your experience, but something that is necessary because of, or not just because of your experience, but you have derived at its necessity because of the experience that you have. So that's all kind of thrown away. And it moves beyond just questions of God, as we're going to talk about it. David Hume expands this to all sorts of areas, such as the reality of causes and what causes what, and whether causation even exists at all. So things like the soul, you could never arrive at that because that's not a direct impression. And so in doing this, David Hume has really significantly limited the field of human knowledge. He has really significantly limited what it is that human beings are actually capable of knowing. And it is basically just our impressions and then combinations of those impressions, and that's it. So there is no reasoning about things in themselves. We're not really reasoning about the world as it is for David Hume. We're really just reasoning about our own subjective experiences. And there's a kind of shared experience that he's going to talk about here, but we're really just reasoning about experiences and from experiences and never really getting beyond experiences. That's just all that there is. And so there's really no way to arrive at metaphysical truths. There's no way within Descartes' method or Hume's method. There is no way that we could arrive at the existence of things outside of that direct experience. So, the existence of a soul, or the existence of God, the existence really even of other minds, or really of the existence of the self at all. Okay. Now let's talk about one of the kind of consequences of his method. And this is one that he explains a lot. And one of the areas where Hume is really influential is with the question of causation. So what's his idea of causes here? Well, we have to understand a little bit about classical views of the causes, especially through Aristotle, which really dominated the academy for a significant period of time in the Western world. So let me just quickly outline this as quickly as I can to say this is what he's responding to. So Aristotle has what are called the four causes. And for Aristotle, we can look at any given thing and ask what are the causes of this thing, and we can break that up into four different categories. So we have a material cause, a formal cause, an efficient cause, and a final cause. I'm going to use the example of a rubber ball here as your kind of go-to example to understand what are these causes. A material cause essentially is the question of what is it that makes up this thing. It doesn't have to be a physical thing, but in this case it is. So this is a rubber ball here. So what is the material cause of this ball is rubber. That's what makes the thing up. That's its material. It's its matter. The formal cause is the shape that the thing takes. And it doesn't have to just mean physically. It means like what that thing is, right? The essence of the thing, the form. But the shape that this thing takes, it is a ball, right? That's the shape and the object that it is. So that, in other words, that rubber, if it was just material by itself and didn't take on this form, it would just be rubber. It wouldn't be a ball, but it has to take on this particular form in order to be a rubber ball. Okay, so the formal cause is the ball, the shape of ball. All right, then the efficient cause is the question of what was the thing that directly made it what it is. So what actually was the thing that produced it? And so you could talk about the efficient cause of this ball being, the machines in the factory that put this thing together, people that work on those machines as causes of the existence of this ball. The final, and that tends to be how we usually use cause, right? So efficient cause is the closest cause in Aristotle's categories to what we usually call causes in just our ordinary experience today. The final cause is the goal of that thing, like the question of what is it for? So the final cause of a rubber ball is to be thrown and bounced by a kid, right? That's the purpose of it. Why does it exist? Why are we spending time making this thing? The final, well, I mean, yeah, maybe you're making this thing for the sake of gaining profit, but ultimately the purpose of the thing really should be more than gaining profit. The purpose of it is it's to be used, to be played with, to be thrown. And so that's basically the four causes. Now, what happens with Descartes is Descartes really gets rid of these other causes and sticks pretty much just with the efficient cause. So final causes are not just about material products that humans create. Final causes in the way that it's used classically refers to goals that are in things, right? Ends that are present within things. So that could be like within the creation of some organization, or within a human life, or within an object. All of these things have ends, but it also is true in nature. And so nature has final causes. There is a purpose in nature. So when you're looking at a natural process, you can ask questions like, well, what is that for? What is the process of photosynthesis for? And for Descartes, that question of final causality or goal-orientedness in nature really is no longer present. He conceives of nature more as like a machine that just kind of has a bunch of parts that they do what they do. And so there's a move away from those kind of questions of purpose or teleology within nature. But then Hume is really dealing with the question of efficient causes, and in a way he kind of completes what begins with Descartes here, in that he starts to now move away even from those efficient causes. So he deals with the question of causal necessity. A causal necessity meaning that there is a necessary connection between a cause and then an effect that arises out of that cause. And so there is this inherent necessary connection between one event and then a following event. So let's use the example here of heat and a fire. Okay, so if you walk into a room with a fireplace and you feel the heat of the fireplace, it is your natural inclination, if you look at a fire and you feel heat, to look at that and say, oh, the fire is causing heat. And we determine that not just because we experienced heat and fire at the same moment once. You can have all sorts of sensations that occur together at the same time. It doesn't mean they're necessarily, connected. Perhaps your first experience seeing fire is a scented candle, right? So if you see fire and you smell the scent of the candle, and perhaps maybe you have a repeated pattern of that, as a child, maybe you make the connection of, oh, well, fire smells like that, right? It's like fire smells like the maple candle because my parents have the Yankee candle, maple candle lit all the time. Well, that's not a causal connection. They may be connected in your experience, and that both of those things happen at the same time, but it's not a direct causal connection because you go to plenty of fires and they'll smell like that. So causal necessity is when we say that we have an experience of two things at the same time and say it's more than just that kind of coincidental, we're experiencing these two things at the same time, like the scent of the maple candle and the fire. And so when something is repeated in our experience, such that every single time we're near a fire, it's hot, we say, well, there's a causal relation. It's hot because of the fire, not just coincidentally there happens to be heat whenever I happen to walk near fire. And Hume, though, says that there's really no way to determine whether there is some kind of potentiality within a thing. So like a potentiality within fire to be hot. And that potentiality is always actualized when there is a fire because there's no fire without heat. But he says there's no way to really determine the relationship between objects to one another or an object to an experience of what happens when you're near that object. We can't really even have knowledge of the objects at all. All we really know is I have a sense or an impression of fire and I have an impression of heat. One is a feeling in the body and the other is something that is seen or heard. And we just connect those things. But because of his methodology, because he doesn't believe we can work outside of experience at all to arrive at truths outside of that, he basically says we can't really know. Like there's no way to actually know that fire causes heat. And we could say, well, this isn't the same as like the candle and the smell, right? The fire and the smell of the candle, because we have all sorts of examples of people seeing fire and not smelling the candle, but we have no experiences in the history of the world, as far as we know, of anyone going to a fire that doesn't have heat. But Hume says it doesn't really matter. Like that still doesn't prove anything. Like even if you were going to show that it's universal, first of all, you can't show it's universal. You can't look at every fire across all space and time at the same time. Even if you were to do that on this Earth, maybe there's some planet somewhere else that exists in some other galaxy where, there are a bunch of aliens that sit down by fire and they're cold when they're by fire because the fire doesn't give off heat. Well, how can you prove that that's not the case? Even if you could prove that, Hume says, but we just work with this assumption. And that assumption is that the future is going to be like the past. So we have the assumption that, well, every time I've been near fire, it's got heat, so that means that it's always going to be that way. But Hume says we can't really prove that. Like there's no definitive way to show that we can actually that we will never experience a time where all of a sudden the properties of fire totally change. How are you going to know that? And so Hume does really lead to this kind of total skepticism about the world. But he doesn't really view himself just that way. And this is what people are going to point at who have the more constructive view of Hume to say. He's not just doing that, though. But Hume does kind of say that we can basically trust that it's the case, that fire has heat, and we shouldn't live as if it doesn't. He's not telling people to go jump in a fire, but because who knows if it has heat or not. But he basically says, well, but it's just kind of custom. By custom, we inherit custom, and in our inherited custom, we just believe that this is just generally going to be the case. But it's not definitive certainty. We're really just working with, well, it's kind of what we all believe and what we've experienced, so we just kind of say it's the case, and it is, until something proves differently. And so we just kind of function based on that anyway. And then we get to what is a really central question, and one that I talk about all throughout this series, and this is one of the major, I think, issues with a lot of modern and postmodern philosophy especially, is that there is no clear answer to the question of what the self is. And many modern philosophical systems lead to the conclusion that the self either doesn't exist or that we have no way of knowing whether we actually exist or not as a self-subsistent thing with a coherent, continual identity throughout life. Now, Descartes didn't get there. I mean, Descartes' whole system is built on really two basic beliefs. One is that I exist and God exists. But Hume denies both of those things. And so Descartes proceeds in his system with the assumption that if thinking exists, a subject must exist to do that thinking. As I said, Hume gets rid of that and says, no, that's unwarranted. We have no definitive reason why we should move from one conclusion to the next. And this is really connected to Hume's rejection of causality, right? So if we can't really determine the causes of things at all, then I can't determine that a human mind is the cause of a thought. We can't have causal connections. They're just, those causal connections are not definitive. Instead, all we have in terms of belief in a self, that you are an individual, the only thing you have is custom, that's how we speak about ourselves. But there's not really much beyond that. And so Hume says, well, it might be so here's what we do, right? We have impressions, we have sensations. We have sensations of all sorts of things, and those sensations are often, connected to one another. So I've had a variety of sensations today. I have the sensation right now of speaking and hearing my own voice and moving my mouth. Those are all sensations. And I have sensations of eating breakfast and drinking my coffee in the morning, and we have sensations of all sorts of things. Well, I've got these tons of sensations that occur throughout the day that have already happened. It's only the afternoon, but I've had a ridiculous amount of sensations. And we assume that the many sensations must be connected to each other, in that they're all connected to one person having the sensations. So we have this belief that we have an actual consistent self-identity, a continuous self-identity, that I am the same actual person, that I am in some real sense the same subject that has had all of those experiences today. And Hume doesn't buy that. Instead, Hume, because all he really knows is these impressions, and he believes all knowledge comes from impressions, so our only knowledge of reality is impressions, says that human beings really aren't these in any way transcendent things or self-consistent things. Instead, all we are is just a bundle of a bunch of impressions. So the only way that he can say I exist is in the sense that there are a bunch of impressions that happen, and those are kind of all bundled together. Those are all kind of squished together into related experiences. And so we call that a self. But there is no real self for Hume, certainly not definitively. So those are really the major elements of his philosophy in terms of how he's going to really start to change the conversation. What's so significant about Hume, even more than Hume, is really that he is going to lead to the questions that Immanuel Kant starts to answer. And Kant really becomes the more significant figure that has a major school of thought that follows him, and pretty much all philosophy since is really trying to address things that Kant says. But Kant is addressing Hume. And so Hume's influence is sometimes direct, but I think more often really by means of Immanuel Kant. So his religious views. And I mentioned this before, that his religious views were essential to his personal narrative because his skepticism of traditional Christian commitments was that which caused him not to receive this teaching position. So what are those religious views exactly? And let me just say this actually before I even get into this, because I mentioned this at the beginning, but I think it's important to know this as we're delving into this issue. There are a lot of interpretations of David Hume in terms of where to exactly classify him. And so there are those who say, well, he was just an adamant atheist and recognized that, like, Christians are all stupid and superstitious. This is like the new atheist types, from back in the day, kind of used Hume in this way from, 20 years ago now. And that's really not what David Hume is doing. David Hume is not, like, convinced of atheism. And I think David Hume would also question a lot of the commitments that those people have. Because the issue isn't just that he is an atheist. The issue is that he's skeptical about human knowledge of anything. That's kind of the whole point of the system, is that we don't really know much of anything. So it goes far beyond questions of religion, though that's certainly essential to his project, but it is not just that. So I think if you want to use David Hume's critiques against Christianity or against just theism in general, those critiques really only work well, at least, if you adopt his entire skeptical system, because that's where this stuff comes from, which I think a lot of people aren't quite willing to do. But there are interpretations that say he was kind of a deist, which would make sense with his time, or those who would just basically say, well, he's not saying God doesn't exist at all. All he's saying is that our human minds aren't capable of knowing anything, right? So this is the idea that it's clear in Hume that, like, we just aren't capable of knowing much. So this could just be a kind of maybe absolute hands-off, I don't know, who knows anything, which doesn't really address the question at all. And that's kind of where someone like Immanuel Kant ends up, which is to say that he thinks religion is useful, but we have no way of knowing the thing in itself. We have no way of coming to a knowledge of God in one way or another, so we just kind of make assumptions. But there's no definitive way to know at all. Now, I think that's being a little kind to Hume. I think he's harsher than that. I think he's more of a critic than that, but I still don't think he's an adamant atheist. But the other problem, along with these different interpretations, is that his major work on religious issues is a dialogue with multiple characters, and we are never told what he actually thinks about these things. And the way that he seems to have spoken about it seems to be that he's more just getting people to think through the questions and not actually wanting to have a definitive answer to any of it. All right. So the major issue here is that the way that he has developed his method of inquiry, his mode of knowledge, he's rejected metaphysics out of hand. So he said, we can't know anything as it is in itself. All we know is our impressions. And so if you've rejected the idea of metaphysics, then you have no knowledge of the existence of God, the eternality of the soul, or the existence of the soul at all, the miraculous, the afterlife. So we don't have any way of even knowing whether these things could be true for Hume. What he is going to do, though, is he's going to show what he thinks are contradictions within the systems, the theological systems that argue for these kinds of things. So he argues against the eternality of the soul by just saying, well, the arguments you're using for it don't really hold up because those arguments have contradictions within them. And so, he'll say, like, well, to believe in the existence of a soul, you have to think there's a separate kind of soul substance that's different from a material substance. Now, that's by itself, that's something that could be questioned. But and if that's the case, then the material substance dies. So why would you make the assumption that the soul substance dies? And if the soul substance is one that is incapable of death or of non-existence, then you have to really logically commit to the notion that not only that the soul has an afterlife, but also that the soul has always existed. But that's not what most people are willing to do, And so his arguments are much more tearing down anything than trying to establish anything definitively. And I think that's really the point that Hume is getting at, is we can't really know anything. And like, you think all these logical arguments, rational arguments work, and they don't even really work. So who knows? He does have a much more positive argument against miracles, or at least, this isn't even really against miracles either. This is really more just against knowledge of miracles. Because if everything for Hume is impressions, and these impressions build up what we call custom, that we all just kind of trust or assume, those customs arise out of repeated impressions, right? So the custom, the believing that, or assuming that fire causes heat, arises from a series of experiences. Now, we know scientific laws as these kind of customs that arise through repeated experiences. And so they work, right? Because it's repeated. But a miracle by its very nature is something that is not ordinary. So by its very nature, the miraculous is something that is a break from what are those ordinary impressions that we have that cause those customs. And so something out of the ordinary can never become this kind of custom, right? It can never become this thing that we trust in or rely on. So therefore, we cannot rely on miracles. But you see, the whole argument against miracles really relies on his whole system. So it doesn't work just by itself. And I know that people kind of taken that argument outside of Hume's system and tried to make it work in other ways. But it really does derive from a particular metaphysical commitment or epistemological commitment or lack of metaphysical commitments. So I don't think it can be isolated. Then let's get to the question of ethics. We're almost done here. Ethics, very much related to, the last subject of religion here. And remember that the position that he was trying to get was teaching about morality, teaching on ethics at Edinburgh. Now, in his ethical theory, he does have something of a positive ethical theory, but I don't think it's a very clear one. Certainly not one that has these very definitive kind of clear lines of here's how you know what's right and what's wrong. Though the utilitarians are actually going to cite Hume as the basis for their ideas, though I don't think Hume would quite be categorized as a utilitarian, though some have interpreted him in that way. But he leads the way to some of that. He has two basic ethical models that he's skeptical of and that he critiques. And the first of those is a more natural law kind of theory of morality. And this would be the traditional Christian approach to morality, which says that there is a law within nature. There is a natural law that God has imprinted as moral law on the world, so that if we use our rational capacities appropriately and well, that means that we will be able to come to conclusions about moral truths through observation and reasoning via observation, and talking about what are kind of good moral ends and what are the actions that would lead to those proper moral ends and those kinds of things. But his critique is of a particular individual named Samuel Clarke, who's more of a kind of rationalist ethicist who has this more objective conception of moral law. And so on the one hand, he rejects all kinds of these natural law theories. And there are a variety of natural law theories that aren't always identical with the Christian one, like what you get in John Locke is very different. Then you have the theories of Thomas Hobbes, another figure that we're going to examine in this series, but I haven't done yet. And that is Thomas Hobbes. This is in his Leviathan, but Hobbes actually wrote a lot more than just his political writing on Leviathan. He's got a much more complex system than just that. He's got kind of a totalizing philosophy that was not very influential in other areas. But Hobbes in the Leviathan has this notion of human nature that essentially everything we do is self-interested, that by nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. So without the coercive powers of the state, we are in this state of self-absorption and chaos. We're just self-interested beings. And so there are ideas that grow out of this, that morality is essentially just something that's kind of imposed on people to stop them from destroying each other because we're by nature self-interested. So Hume rejects this notion that humanity is only self-interested. So he wants to reject both this kind of natural law theory that reason can bring us to actual inherent necessary truths about rationality. And then he also wants to reject this idea that human nature is by nature just selfish. So there's really nothing more to it than that. For for Hume, the ground of morality is really in sentiment. It seems like a strange way to talk about morality to people today. But sentiment, what he's referring to there is really that we have these kind of inherent feelings that are within. And everything is focused on kind of internal experience, or what we might call feeling, because impressions are those immediate experiences, and that's the focus of his philosophy. And so some of those impressions that we have are impressions of, especially those kind of secondary impressions that we talked about, that are those feelings. A lot of those secondary impressions are feelings of like disgust when somebody does a certain action that seems evil, or feeling of delight when somebody does something that we consider to be morally good, or feeling of wow, that's heartwarming, and we use that kind of language. So there is this internal sense of that we have of sentiment, of either approval or disapproval of somebody's moral actions. And so since impressions are really the basis for everything, Hume wants to make a notion of ethics that arises from sentiment. And so there is no kind of objective moral system, really, but morality arises from these feelings that we have, this inner sentiment of approval morally and moral disapproval. And in this, he's much less of a skeptic of human nature in terms of the goodness of human nature than Hobbes. But he's skeptical that there is such a thing as a human nature. But he believes that people are naturally oriented not just to feeling kind of moral feelings, say, about themselves, but there is this kind of sense of what is good that we have for the whole, not just the self. So we're not inherently just selfish beings. And morality is centered around this idea of sympathy. And it's that sympathy that is within the sentiment, right? It's in the self. It's a feeling that we have. But sympathy connects us with morality that is outside of the self, right? And that's sympathy is really the heart of what demonstrates for Hume that we are not just self-interested, because we have sympathy for those who are hurt, and we have moral outrage for those who have perpetrated hurt in various ways. And so the system of the ethical system, whatever ethical system we have in a society, essentially really grows out of that sentiment for Hume. Now, this leads to a final question that I want to ask, which maybe seems a little bit odd for those who aren't familiar with David Hume. And that is the question, was David Hume a conservative? So why do I even ask this question? Because when you look at David Hume, we see him as this kind of ultimate skeptic. And as I've said, I tend to be more in the interpretive framework looking at David Hume that says that I think skepticism really does drive his thought more than the positive project. I don't know. Could be wrong about that, but that's my read of Hume. And so because you view him as this great skeptic, or people view him as this great skeptic, especially of a lot of things that are like traditionally inherited in the West, like Christianity, he's at least skeptical of the metaphysical claims of Christianity, though that's a very different question than whether one is skeptical of Christianity in terms of its societal value, or historic connections to Christian institutions or ideas. They're not the same question. So David Hume, because he's so skeptical of like classical metaphysical truths, and he's so radical in his philosophy, he would certainly seem like one who you would generally consider to be a liberal, if you're doing the kind of, not in the sense of liberalism as a political theory, but the kind of scale of thought, right? If you have conservatism over here and liberalism over here, it seemed that Hume's pretty far over on this side, right? But Hume has actually been classified by some as a conservative thinker. So you can get, conservative readers, for example, that have selections of David Hume within them. So why on earth would David Hume be connected to conservatism? Well, the early conservatives, and Edmund Burke, who is considered he's a contemporary here. He's older than David Hume, but they're both living in the 18th century. So Edmund Burke is generally considered the father of modern conservatism as a thing, as we're talking about it now. You could talk about a pre-modern conservatism, it's kind of a different thing. But Edmund Burke is really an empiricist. And the early conservatives that agree with Edmund Burke are really all empiricists as well. Well, why is that? The rationalists tended to have a view of government, just like everything else, that arose from kind of abstraction, or rational abstraction. And so the rationalists would look at these principles of reason that they had outlined and say, okay, what's reasonable, what's rational, and what is true. And they believed that they could apply that to the question of politics, to say, well, we can look at the question of politics not in the sense of kind of where we are in history or what our culture is, who our people are. Instead, we can look at politics by abstractifying. We abstractify humanity and human nature and say, okay, what is human nature? Let's outline what that is. And we outline human nature in what they call the state of nature. So if you have human nature that's outlined here, then you have a question of, well, what is the state? What is the purpose of the state? Why was it created? And then you come up with this kind of theoretical construct of what humanity is, what the state is, and then you try to enforce that kind of abstraction of what the state is for upon a society. But it comes out of this speculative reasoning. And that's what liberalism tends to do, right? It operates from this principle of rationality. You have this kind of rational conception of the state, and then you impose it upon people because you figured out what's best for people in the abstract. Now, conservatives want to work not in the abstract, but in the particular, right? So conservatives want to say in political theory that we want to work with the culture where it is. We want to look at the historic development of that culture. What are the rites and rituals of that culture? What are the values of that culture? And then how is it that we, preserve the goodness of those values? And yes, there are questions of how do we improve? How do we deal with various injustices in a society, as Burke does throughout his writings. But they're working within this kind of empiricist framework rather than a rationalist one. And so for that reason, the empiricists, though they can often be skeptics, like Hume being the ultimate example, that doesn't mean that they're not also in some sense conservative. And so it's history and experience that are essential to thinking about the nature of the state rather than this kind of abstract contemplation of what government is. Hume has this focus on custom, inherited custom, and he's puts so much into this category of custom here, like, basic truths about reality are just custom. But you could see how that would be considered kind of a conservative principle, right? The conservatives were concerned with the passing down of custom and tradition and inheritance. The move away from the pure theoretical to practical and actual experience that you see in someone like David Hume is seen as a very conservative kind of impulse to not just deal in the realm of the mind, but to say, well, what does this mean practically for actual experience? Hume, in terms of his view of government, he rejects this idea of the social contract. And so he rejects this notion that there is some kind of state of nature that we can figure out whatever that was, and then kind of abstractify and say, okay, well, if human nature was like this, then there was this kind of moment where someone made a contract between people and the state, and out of this arose the state. He says that government really just rests on this kind of continued public consent to the government that currently exists. And that's really all there is to it. So he's certainly going to reject any notion of a divine backing of the authority of the state, because he isn't committed to God's existence even. But it's just kind of, if there's public consent, the government has authority, and that's kind of it. He did oppose revolution in a lot of ways. There are at least arguments that he's very similar to Edmund Burke in some way. I don't know. In his rejection of revolution, he does go live in France, though. He was a friend of Benjamin Franklin, interestingly, and Thomas Jefferson hated David Hume. Jefferson didn't like Burke either, at least initially. I think he softened at least some later. But so he was a friend of Benjamin Franklin, and he did support the American Revolution, but he didn't really see the American Revolution as this kind of total overthrow of custom or something in the way that, like the French Revolution would have been. And then he was friends with Adam Smith, interestingly. Well, that is all I have for you here on David Hume. There is a lot to his philosophy. When you're dealing with any of these major thinkers, and the ones that we've been talking about in this series, especially these earlier ones, their philosophies are so kind of all-encompassing that you do so much, right, on each of these figures. And so we're trying to just boil down what are some of the basic kind of key takeaways of these thinkers, so that you get a picture of how this, how ideology developed throughout the centuries from Descartes all the way into the modern world. So if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, make sure you do that. And I also have all of this on a podcast. You can look up Justin Sinner on whatever your podcast app is if you want to just listen while you're in the car or whatever you're doing. And you could do both of those things. So thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.